thanks very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Just a quick word about Barack Obama. What happened was he came out with a list of books that he thought future leaders ought to take a look at. And lo and behold, I found mine. I wrote a biography of Andy Grove. I'm old. I used to be young like you, but now I'm old. That's how this works. And back when I was young like you, Andy Grove was one of the giants of Silicon Valley. I mean, this was the age of Wintel. Do you know what that is? It's Windows Intel. It's the Microsoft Intel bilateral duopoly, which was vital in the computer revolution. Intel, when I first went out to Silicon Valley as a professor, I addressed the executives at Intel. This was in 1991, and the two anchor tenants of Silicon Valley were HP and Intel. That's not true now, and there's a lesson there. Anyway, so when it came out that Barack Obama said that my book was, so I said I'm going to send him a copy of it, signed. And a friend of mine who actually held the first fundraiser for Barack Obama in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and in 2004 suggested that he run for the presidency. Said you can't just send a book to the president. I said, you have mail, I pay taxes, but apparently, books. This is true. This is the world we're living in. Someone's got to look at every page. Does it have anthrax on it or something like that? It's got to be vacuumed. And so the book was fully vetted page by page by page. And I got a letter from him, which is probably one of the last letters he wrote while he was still in the White House, and I have that framed. But that was just another lesson in the world in which we're living. You can't just send a book to the president. You wouldn't think it'd be that hard. It is. So what I want to do is I'm just an historian. I gave a talk at the law school, I don't know, what was it, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, whenever it was, and also at Omar's in your shop. And when you're an historian, I mean, you people, entrepreneurs are about the future. I'm not. I mean, I'm very good at predicting the past, but I have no idea about what's really going to happen in the future. Nevertheless, one of the things that you try to learn as an historian is patterns. And I've put together some remarks that won't take too long. If you'll just indulge me, I want to read them to you because I don't have slides, and there's a pattern that I've seen. And the pattern basically goes from Andrew Carnegie to Steve Jobs. So let me just sort of sketch that out. And then I really would like to throw it open. I have spent the last 8 years of my life at Apple. It was not a job that I wanted or expected. I thought I was going to retire when I was 63 in 2010. They flew me out there, and I had an interview with all these, Tim Cook, Johnny Ive, Peter Oppenheimer, who was at the time CFO. The CFO is now Luca Maestri. And it was kind of an intriguing experience. The first two interviews, the interviewers did all the talking. So I said, okay, this can't be bad, And also, it was January. I was in Boston. They flew me out to, where there was no snow. So if they wanted me to come to the office and hear them talk, that's fine with me. Then Cook came in. This was when Steve Jobs was still alive, so he was not the CEO of the company yet. And he just sat there. And that was when I discovered that Tim Cook does not mind silence. And so I'm looking at him, he's looking at me. We're on the 4th floor of Infinite Loop, which is, I don't know if has anyone ever been to the Apple campus? Okay, it's now moved, it's now a high spaceship. But it used to be Infinite Loop was the headquarters. We were in a room called Apple Teeny. And I thought, this guy's probably being paid a lot of money, and why don't I ask him a question? So I asked him a good business school kind of question, and he was a Fuqua scholar at the Duke School of Business, and he's very smart. And he gave a really good business school kind of answer, and then he asked me, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, we can have a regular discussion. In the middle of this is a true story, I had that briefcase with me, and in the middle of this, I had a phone in there, and it rang. And I said, listen, Tim, I know this is rude, you have to forgive me, but this is a call that I have to take. because my wife had spent the previous evening at the Stanford University Hospital. She had just gotten out. I had to make sure she was okay. He said, fine. So I took it out of that briefcase, put it back in, and I said, let's continue. And he just looked at me and he said, that wasn't an iPhone. And I said, I knew that was going to happen. But it was an interesting lesson to me. I didn't know what an insult it was to show up on that campus with a Palm Pilot. I didn't understand the intensity with which the people, and there are now well over 140,000 employees at Apple, my guess would be worldwide, haven't looked lately, the intensity with which this company is product focused, with which Apple is product focused. It's design first, product first. Everything else comes second. And to come there with a phone that wasn't an Apple phone was an insult. But I didn't know it at the time, and they gave me the job anyway. It was a remarkable series of interviews. Peter Oppenheimer came in, and they knew I was an historian. So I said, have you been to the Apple Museum? And I go to museums when I go to places. And I said, I didn't know Apple had a museum. He said, we don't. Apple's about the future. Something. you paid for the plane ticket. But I was actually sorry to see Peter go because he was, I think, an outstanding CFO. And one of the slogans at Apple, which actually is true, is that everybody sweeps the floor. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. The guy who is the VP of antennas, which matters, like there's an antenna here, there's an antenna here. When something goes wrong with the antenna, you have antenna gate, that's bad. Anyway, the guy who runs, who's the double E, who's in charge of antennas, he was conceived in Spain and born in Chile. Terrific. I mean, he's the kind of person you would stick your arm in fire for. It turned out he's got a lab, and it turned out a pipe had burst in the lab. This is a true story. And meanwhile, there's water all over some equipment that's pretty expensive. And he hears about it, goes right down to Infinite Loop, shows up there to clean the place up. And who's there? Peter Oppenheimer is there first already. This is a man making $22 million a year, public. Doesn't matter. Everybody sweeps the floor. That's part of the core of Apple culture. And the reason Apple University was created by Steve Jobs, and their fear is that the culture is going to get lost. There are three ways, basically, to organize a company. You can organize it by hierarchy. Do this because I say so. Someone gives you an order, you go and do it. I was at a restaurant, I think is there a restaurant called The Hula or not? Sort of located on Waikiki. I mean, it has to be. Yes, right. And you could tell that was very hierarchical. I mean, the wait staff couldn't make a decision without checking with the central office. So that's one way to organize a company. Another way to organize a company is bureaucracy. So what to do? Check the manual. Take a look at the manual. I mean, that's United Airlines. Some of you may have seen, because it went viral, the picture of this guy who got dragged off United Airlines because he wanted a seat and they didn't get it. Now, why do you suppose that happened? By the way, I was told that he got $60 million settlement. That's either true or it isn't, but it ought to be. And the next time I got on a United plane, and I'm getting on another one soon, so pray for me. The next time I got on a United plane, I said, these two front teeth, $60 million, I'm willing to talk. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Because nobody who works for that airline, which would be out of business in a nanosecond if Swiss Air could compete against them flying from here to San Francisco, no one in that airline is allowed to think. There's a manual. The manual said, this seat is for, by the way, not even a customer. This seat is for one of our employees. You're just a customer. Out. He didn't want to go. The result was ridiculous. The third way to organize a company is culture. And that's when people do the right thing without being told. That's when everybody sweeps the floor. That's the best way because you don't have to micromanage anybody. The problem is it doesn't scale well. And that's, right now, today, this minute, that's Apple's biggest challenge. So anyway, I've got a story to tell. Let me tell it, and I'll speak as quickly as possible, so you can, if you want to take a nap, that's fine. The argument of the presentation that I threw together is simple, and that's that American business leaders of the late 19th century are more similar to those of today than they are to those of the 1950s and the 1960s. In other words, the people in the late 19th century are more similar to the people of the early 21st century than they are to the people of my youth, the 1950s and the 1960s. So let me start with a story about something that happened on October 5th, 2011. That was the day that Steve Jobs died. And I was at that time working at Apple University, which is the internal executive education arm at Apple. And I was utterly startled by what happened. I wasn't startled that he had died. Everyone knew that he was very ill and died of pancreatic cancer. What startled me were the number of messages that that company received from all over the world of condolence. And some of them, what we tried to do, there was a ceremony at Apple for Steve Jobs, and there were kiosks, and we wanted to get these messages on the kiosks. And they were in every language that you can imagine. Some of them came in alphabets that none of us in our shop recognized. We didn't understand the alphabets. So it was very hard to get them translated. We didn't know who to take it to. I mean, Apple's a very global company, so somebody at Apple speaks anything, but you've got to know who to ask. And if any of you happen to walk by an Apple store on October 5th or 6th or 7th, 2011, you would have seen notes pasted to the windows, and some people left bouquets. And I mean, it was really, there are hundreds of thousands, I've been told millions of these messages. So before I go on, let me ask a question. Why do you suppose that happened? I don't think maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think there's another CEO in the world that would happen to. If he or she were to pass away, there'd be millions of messages from all over the world of condolence. Why do you suppose that happened? I'm serious. Anybody want to guess? I see a hand. It's true it's not up, but I see a hand. Thank you for volunteering. I don't know what the answer is. What do you think?
I guess Steve Jobs as the icon of this brand is impactful to people's life. Not just lifestyle, but their life.
So impactful for people's life, not just their lifestyle, but their lives. And there's a hand up over here.
I was just going to say that they designed many of the artifacts to be so intimate that people felt like it was a part of their personal life and not just a brand that they had a relationship with.
They were connected through the product, in other words. It wasn't just a brand. This wasn't Tide or Cheer or Gleam or you name it. I mean, it was something that, any other guesses? Because I don't know. Go ahead.
I think people appreciated his almost a perfectionist approach to user orientation and user experiences.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, you maybe you'll disagree, but I mean, to me, and I don't work for the company anymore, so, but this is beautiful. I mean, they privilege design. That's not what we taught at the Harvard Business School. I mean, what we taught is you have a company and you could have a conglomerate and you manage by the numbers. That's not what they do. I mean, they're very quantitative. Believe me, the place is stinking with engineers and scientists. But that's not what comes first. What comes first is design. When Tim Cook is asked, what questions come to me? And there are like thousands of decisions that have to be made at Apple every day. If you look at the stores, there are millions of moments of truth where the customer is impacted by the company. So there are two kinds of decisions that have to come to me. One is if an issue comes up that deals with the customer, I need to know. The other is if an issue comes up that can't be reversed. If a decision comes up that can't be reversed, those are the decisions that have to come to me. Because Apple is not a business unit company. You know what I mean by that? There's a single P&L. It's all him. I mean, it's a very vertically integrated, very managerially light company. I think it's also possible that a lot of people were sort of aware of Jobs' life story, that he was a kid who liked to, play around with his friend Wozniak. I mean, they figured out a way to hack the old telephone system, one of the AT&T telephone called the Pope, and there was a certain amount of pleasure in that. There was a certain amount of empathy because he got fired from the company he founded in 1985, and what did he do then? He founded another company, and that company was Pixar, and Pixar succeeded because Steve Jobs is a great storyteller, and he understands a great story, and he knows, or he knew, when to manage and when to give people space. And if you ask Ed Catmull, I mean, that's what they said. And then he wound up selling Pixar to Disney for $5 billion, and when he died, he actually had more wealth at Pixar than he had at Apple. So I think that in some way, Apple, if you think of, once again, three levels. I mean, there's the just expected, there's a little more, a little better, and there's surprise and delight. Apple's in the surprise and delight business. Now, the other two are very important. You can't just deliver surprise and delight without just expected. That's the story of Apple Maps. To fly over, everything was beautiful except they put Tokyo and Sydney. That was a mistake. If you want a map, that's a problem. But he was a larger-than-life figure. Everybody knew him, everybody knew his name, a lot of people knew his story. He touched millions of people in a unique way. Also, I don't know. It's also true that he saved the company when it was on the verge of bankruptcy. Apple was depending on who you speak to, and I did speak to Peter Oppenheimer about this, it was 6 weeks to 3 months away from not being able to make payroll in 1997. And only Steve Jobs would have been able to convince Bill Gates to invest $150 million in Apple and to have Microsoft write software for the company. Gates might not have done that had it not been for the antitrust case for bundling Internet Explorer with Windows that happened in 1995, and Gates was thoroughly humiliated by a man named David Boyce. This is ancient history now, but I'm an ancient historian, and so that's what I do. Only Jobs could have saved Apple, because only Jobs could have made that sale to Gates. But Apple's success after that, I was mentioning to you, Omar's latest, at the end of fiscal 2003, Apple's market capitalization was $5.2 billion. Now it's $1 trillion. So Apple is America's first $1 trillion company. A lot of that growth took place not because of Steve Jobs, but in spite of him. Steve Jobs was opposed to the App Store. He wanted to have complete control over this. The reason that there's an App Store was that people jailbroke this phone, and he decided, well, we might as well make some money out of this, if this is what's going to be. And now there are billions and billions and billions of dollars have been made for Apple and also for app developers. I mean, anybody can be an entrepreneur. You get it on this phone. There are about 1.4 billion of these in active use in the world. I mean, that's a pretty powerful platform. So Jobs is larger than life, or was larger than life. Now I want to talk to you about the late 19th century. Indulge me. It took me a long time to get my PhD in history, and I was very nervous before my oral. So let's do it from history. If I were to ask you who the presidents of the United States were in 1882, or 1886, or 1892, my guess is that nobody in this room, and in fact nobody in this city, would know. They were Chester A. Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, and Grover Cleveland. My guess is that if I were to ask you anything about these characters, you wouldn't be able to tell me one thing about them. Maybe some of you would know that there was a really dreadful movie made about Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was a pitcher for the New York Giants, starring Ronald Reagan. but that's pretty much it for Golden Cleveland. But if I were to ask you who the most prominent business executives of the between 1882 and 1892, who were the most prominent business executives during that decade, and I were to tell you what their names were, you'd know their names. They're Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. Everyone knows those names. So the government was small, business was big. Those people were icons of their era. Everyone knows those names, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan. Their names are plastered all over New York City. Rockefeller Center has 19 buildings on 22 acres in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. I had in my classes both Michael and Mark Rockefeller, who were descendants of John D. Rockefeller I. And in one of the classes, when you have to teach Standard Oil, and that was the Rockefeller Company, in one of the classes, one of the students looked at Mark Rockefeller and said, what was it like for you the first time you walked past Rockefeller Center? What was it like for you? 19 acres, 22 buildings in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. He said, it was absolutely nothing. He said, I thought everybody had a center. There was a Tedlow Center, there was an Omar Center, there was a Lawrence Center, everybody had a center. This just happened to be ours. And it was actually a nice moment because you got a chance to see the world through somebody else's eyes. How do you grow up a Rockefeller? There is actually no Tedlow Center, maybe there is. Carnegie Halls, I say these names are plastered all over Manhattan. Carnegie Hall's the world famous venue for music. J.P. Morgan's house is on 37th Street in Madison Avenue, which is worth seeing. Rockefeller said of J.P. Morgan at Morgan's death, he wasn't even that rich, and compared to Rockefeller, that's true, but compared to me, it isn't. And of course, there are two major firms that still have Morgan's name, J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley. Carnegie and Rockefeller had a lot in common. They were both men of the real rather than of the financial economy. Both were tough, shrewd, and ruthless. Both carried on a mad, passionate love affair with money, and their love did not go unrequited. Unlike Rockefeller, Carnegie loved publicity. He was a successful executive on the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the most important company in the country in the 1850s, before he went into business for himself. So he was a general manager, actually, before he became an entrepreneur, which is interesting. He also was very successful in finance, but then he got out of that. He was on the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1853 to 1865, and then sold bonds from 1865 to 1872, and in 1872 is when he went to the steel business. Because he said, I want to make something tangible, and I don't want to be at anybody's beck and call. And when he retired in 1901, he was the richest man in the world, and the most successful steel manufacturer also in the world. Steel, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, is vital. I mean, the Japanese, after World War II, called it the rice of industry. I mean, it was absolutely vital, and Carnegie was the king of steel. It was J.P. Morgan, the nation's leading financier, who put Carnegie Steel together with a bunch of other companies like Federal Steel, National Steel, Lake Superior Consolidated Iron Mines, which was owned by John D. Rockefeller. And he put those together into U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel, U.S. Steel was a result of mergers and acquisitions, all arranged by Morgan. And the reason for that was that Morgan didn't like competition. And so if he could arrange mergers and acquisitions to get rid of competition and get rid of Carnegie, whom he paid $300 million for this was at a time when the U.S. GDP was about $20 billion. And U.S. Steel was capitalized in 1901 at $1.4 billion at a time when the total capitalization of all U.S. manufacturing was $9 billion. This is big. He put all this together in order to make everything a little bit more predictable than it had been. What else do I have to say? Carnegie was this ruthless competitor, Morgan was not. One of the critical differences between U.S. Steel and Apple. So U.S. Steel is America's first billion-dollar company, Apple is America's first trillion-dollar company. So let's take a look at these two and see what's different. Is that U.S. Steel grew by mergers and acquisitions. Apple grew organically. If you look at Apple's acquisitions, there have been very few of them. The only one of them that some of them may have heard of was Beats, and in my opinion, that was a mistake. But it was only $3 billion, and that's rounding error for that company right now. I mean, they have something like $300 billion in cash and marketable securities, or some unbelievably large amount of money. A leading socialist said at the time of Morgan's death, Many men have cursed Mr. Morgan because of his control of the money of the world, but never a socialist. We grieve that he could not live longer to further organize the productive forces of the world, because he proved in practice what we hold in theory, that competition is not essential to trade and development. I mean, that was this socialist view of what J.P. Morgan, and Carnegie's view was utterly different from that, and so was Rockefeller's. So at the turn of the 20th century, there was a sense that an era had come to an end. Rockefeller had basically retired, Carnegie retired in 1901, Philip the Armour meatpacking, name you may know, died in 1901. Edward Henry Harriman, who was a big shot railroad baron, died in 1909, and when Harriman died, a financier said, "This is the ending of an epoch in our economic development." Harriman's career was the embodiment of unfettered individualism. That was also Carnegie. When Morgan died, other financiers said, "There will be no other king. Mr. Morgan, typical of the time in which he lived, can have no successor. We are facing other days." And historians are generally agreed on this. If you look at them, have you read Robert Weeby's stuff at all? This is a quote from a well-known historian. "As the barons of the 19th century business retired, their successors appear to have come from a smaller mold. No one ranked William C. Brown of the New York Central with the Vanderbilts." The Vanderbilt family built the New York Central Railroad, which became Penn Central. I mean, it's nothing now, but back in the day it was big. Or George Gould and John D. Rockefeller Jr. with their fathers, or Elbert Gary, U.S. Steel, after Gary, Indiana, his name, with Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel was the heart of U.S. Steel. The emphasis in business was shifting in the turn of the last century from the man to the company, from ingenuity to training, from an ideal of competition to a matter-of-fact belief in cooperation and stabilized profits. There's a famous historian named Richard Hofstadter. These are his words. "Once great men created fortunes. Today," he was writing in 1963, "a great system creates fortunate men." This was the age of movies like and novels like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and Executive Suite. So if you, I showed this at the, I love this, I never go anywhere without it. I mean, this is Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1955. Could you pass this around? This is a guy you've never heard of. Why was he Man of the Year? His name is Harlow Curtis. Take a look at the picture, by the way. You can see the American Eagle holding the steering wheel of the car. It's because he was the CEO of GM. And that was the height of the Detroit-Pittsburgh economy, which was the axis around which everything revolved when I was growing up. Nobody knows who he is. And if you look at the article, which I actually brought with me, but I'm not going to bore you with it, on the business titans, in that cover story, there are names like, Eugene Holman, CEO of Esso, Ralph Kortner, CEO of GE, Roger Blau, CEO of US Steel. I could make a list like that. Nobody's heard of any of them. They're men in gray flannel suits. They're self-satisfied men, follow the rules, rose through the ranks, and were forgotten. But if I were to tell you who the President of the United States was when this magazine came out, it was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and everybody in this room has heard of him. So now the balance between what's big in the country, business versus government, has changed. In Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson observed that an institution is the lengthened shadow of a single man. That any thesis is worth a good overstatement, and someone's trying to get in, and I think that person should be allowed in. They look very nice. Could be a communist, I don't know. Here we go. Okay. Nobody, and when that magazine, which I'm passing around, would have dreamt that in half a century the world of business leadership would be turned upside down. 1955, when that magazine came out, is an interesting year because that's the year Steve Jobs was born. And as I mentioned in the talk that I gave at the law school, does anyone know the story of his parentage? It's quite interesting. Go ahead.
The mother was a refugee, right, from Syria?
Father.
Father was a Syrian refugee.
That's correct.
Not sure about the mother. But I know he grew up from a poor upbringing.
Yes.
Right? And he liked tinkering with things.
Yep. All true.
That's about as far as I can remember.
Well, you've taken us pretty far, but let me just add a couple things. His mother and father weren't married when he was born. So, he wasn't, and not only that, but the first family that adopted him decided they wanted girls, so he went back in the, sort of on the pile. And then the Jobs family took him, and by the way, his Syrian father is still alive. They met. Jobs was illegitimate. Now, today that word means absolutely nothing, and no one cares. But speaking as somebody who was 8 years old in 1955, I can tell you that it meant something in the 50s to have your parents not marry one another when you were born. Part of the way he fought for legitimacy, part of the vector which he used to get the love which those of us who came from two-parent, whatever, took for granted were his products. And that's why if you screwed up one of those products, you lost your job, and it didn't take long. He was a very unconventional child. He was a college dropout. So was Michael Dell. So was Bill Gates. So was Zuckerberg. Two of them, fortunately for Harvard, dropped out of Harvard, because when they do, they always come back and move a building or two or 8. But what's intriguing is they didn't go through the regular credentialing system. I went to Yale and Columbia. They didn't. I finished my degrees. They didn't. Pardon me?
So just to jump in real quick,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
You can jump in slower.
Given where we're at though, there are plenty of successful CEOs that did complete.
There's no question about that. I was about to get to Jeff Bezos.
We've got the dean of the business school again.
I was about to get to Jeff Bezos, who graduated from Princeton as an engineer, and went to Wall Street, and could have made a fortune there, but decided that wasn't for him. Whether you graduate from college or not, whatever you get out of your education, in order to be a truly successful entrepreneur, you've got to think different. That's the lesson here. These people, and by the way, Jobs was a college dropout, but what he did was he hung around. The reason he dropped out of college is because his family was not wealthy. He found out how much it was costing them to send him to read, but he hung around anyway and took courses that interested him. And by the way, was fascinated by calligraphy. He was always interested in beauty. And if you look at Apple products, I think this is actually a good-looking watch. I didn't want to wear a watch before they brought this out. And Apple, which is arrogant about a lot of things, believe me, is very modest when it comes to employee discounts. So this cost me a lot of money. It's also true, obviously, that Robert Noyce got his PhD and finished his PhD from MIT. He was the inventor of the integrated circuit. He was Intel employee #1. Gordon Moore went to Caltech, Intel employee #2. Andy Grove, Intel employee #3, got his PhD in chemical engineering from Berkeley after graduating from City University of New York, City College. And now the School of Engineering at the City College of New York is the Andrew Grove School of Engineering. One of the great things about having these people as graduates, I can give you this advice. My advice to you is to graduate students who wind up making a great deal of money. Because they will.
You're on the other side of the College of Business.
When I finished my class at Harvard, I used to give students two pieces of advice. One was, choose your parents with care, and the other was, be lucky. And that was it. I left. The problem with those two pieces of advice is it's hard to execute. And execute turns out to be sort of important in entrepreneurship. Bezos was a Princeton graduate. So was Meg Whitman. By the way, so was Sheryl Sandberg. Well, she was a Harvard graduate. She was a student of mine at Harvard Business School. Also a graduate of Harvard College. So I didn't mean to thank you for your friendly amendment. I didn't mean to suggest that all these people involved dropped out of college. I did mean by making the point that a lot of them did the following point, that they were able to think different. And that matters. Now, the line between thinking different and thinking crazy is not so easy to find. But they did. Anyway, so we have all these characters, and now the point that I wanted to make was that just as back in the day, business was big, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, these are names that you've heard. But when that magazine came around, Eugene Holman, Roger Blau, you haven't heard of any of those people. Today, business is once again the focus. With that, frankly, comes social responsibility, especially with tech, especially when you hear about artificial intelligence and what that may mean. There are people who are going to have to take responsibility for what they're doing. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves regulated out of existence because it's too dangerous. A perfect example is the self-driving car, which has been hyped and overhyped, and level 5 autonomy, believe me, we're still a long way from. We're a long way from being able to walk into a car that doesn't have a steering wheel and tell it where to go, and it's going to know, whether to stop at that red light or run over that little girl. I mean, it's going to be a long time before we get there. But I also believe, and this is predicting the future, which I said I shouldn't do, that the public is going to be much less forgiving of accidents caused by self-driving cars than it is of accidents caused by human driving cars. I think that because we have become inured to that. Something like 45,000 people a year in the United States die in car accidents. That's a big number, but we're used to it. Every time a self-driving car has a fender bender, it's front page news. People are not used to it and are not going to be forgiving of it, and I think that's true of tech in the future. So I think that people ought to think ahead about what you stand for. I mean, there's an old saying that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And you need that tree trunk of what you stand for before you start to go out and build a company. I think it should start before. One of the things that's intriguing about living in Silicon Valley is you see so many people who want money, who doesn't. But they don't want just money for its own sake. They also want to make a dent in the universe. That's the phrase. They want to make a dent in the universe. Do you? If you do, that's a powerful glue that holds a company together. If you can sell that vision to other people, and they think that if they hitch their wagon to your particular star, you'll be able to develop your own culture, and it's you see it all the time, and it's very exciting. So that's the formal part of the speech. I really would like to just get into a discussion about questions that you may have about the Valley or about anything. I mean, I've been studying business for 4 decades. So I'm at your disposal. Go ahead.
Earlier you mentioned that one of the challenges that Apple has moving forward is how to create a scalable culture
Right.
with intrinsic motivation.
Right.
From its early beginnings until now, what are some of the lessons that it's learned, or some of the best practices that we might be able to?
That's a key question. Let me put it this way. The first time that Tim Cook took an earnings call, because Steve Jobs was on a medical leave, one of the analysts, do you know what I'm talking about here? So one of the analysts said, we all hope that Steve gets better, but if he doesn't, are we to assume that you're going to be the next CEO? Peter Oppenheimer, who was the CFO at the time, and answered immediately, Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple. And Tim said, let me just add something to that. What we have is a company that's utterly detail-oriented, that's devoted to customers, that's product-first company, and that's called the Cook Doctrine. And if somebody were kind enough to go on the internet right now and look up Cook Doctrine, I think you would find it. And so the very small set of principles, customer first, design first, quality first, everything else second. If people keep that in mind, and let me give you sort of just one kind of example of that. A number of years ago when the iPad was new, Christmas time came around. This happened in Seattle, Washington. it turned out that one of the executives discovered that, no fault of their own, because of UPS or something like that, 12 iPads were not going to be delivered to people who had ordered them in plenty of time for Christmas Eve. And so what this guy did was he called Apple stores, asked them to deliver. We don't deliver. He went to a local Apple warehouse, basically, got the iPads that were configured on the orders, and said, I'll just Uber them to, Uber doesn't deliver, it turns out, at least not in Seattle. You can't put an iPad in Uber and send it to somebody's house. So he and his son took these 12 iPads and went from house to house to house. Some of them, one was a gated house, had to climb over a wall, somebody was a thief, and delivered these iPads, these 12 iPads. That's how they spent their Christmas Eve, he and his son. The only way Apple found out about that was that one of the customers sent an email to Jeff Williams, who's the chief operating officer of the company, and said, if this is the way you operate, you've got a customer for life. And now, by the way, logistics at Apple has something called Project Blitzen, which has some of this really, they learned a lesson. They have radar, which says if anything looks late and it's Christmas time, we go into panic mode and we get the damn product on there Christmas Eve. But that guy, that's the perfect example of Apple culture. It's a perfect example of doing the right thing without being told and not expecting a spot bonus, not expecting any money in return for that. And as a matter of fact, he didn't even tell his superiors. The only way they found out was that a customer told him. And so stories like that, hero stories like that, get all over a company very fast. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we did at Apple University is we wrote that up, and we have a blog. So that, all the 140,000 people who work for the company know about that. So that's one of the ways. People like doing something extra. I mean, they actually like being their best. I mean, they don't like working for United Airlines. Look at those people. Look, it's better than being unemployed, but just a little. I compare that to the experience that, by the way, this is not 100% consistent, but compare that to your average experience at an Apple store. It's altogether different. Retail is retail. It's not easy. You're on your feet. You're dealing with people who are impatient. If you're in an Apple store, you're dealing with stuff that's technically pretty complicated that you have to explain. You have no private space. You have to smile at people who are being rude to you. That's the job. But they do a lot. And Angela Ahrens, who's now the CEO of retail, she does a great deal to manage the spirit of the people who work in those stores, which, by the way, is about half the companies. It's about 65,000 people. And that's what we were talking about at your shop before. If you want to read an interesting book about having ordinary people do extraordinary things, that book is the story of Sam Walton. You can't think about the Walmart you know now. You have to think about the man Sam Walton. And the book is called Made in America by Sam Walton and John Dewey. You can read it in an afternoon. And it's a fantastic story about how to motivate. And I think that motivation in the face of the impossible is something that's critically important. And certainly, one story that I know in detail, and it's a fascinating story, is this. It's the story of the camera. When the phone came out, the camera was only mentioned in passing by Jobs. In an 80-minute keynote, he mentioned it for less than a minute. It was a 2-megapixel rear-facing camera, and it was nothing. Today, no company, Samsung, you name it, no company can have a smartphone on the market that doesn't have a great camera. You can't compete without it. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm willing to guess that that camera is one of the top 5 apps on the phone. Now people say stuff like the best camera is the one that you've got with you, or this is really a camera with a phone attached. Apple was able to learn from lead users. They learned a lot about their products from how people used them when they went out into the wild. And that's why, and this I know I'm contradicting received wisdom, Apple does not believe in focus groups. I think that's a little crazy personally, but they don't. And the reason that they don't is something that Steve Jobs said. He said that if Henry Ford had had a focus group, the focus groups would have said, give us a faster horse. Nobody would have said, what you need is a Model T. So there's a certain amount of vision and a certain amount of imagination that's necessary. And I'm not sure it can be taught, but it certainly can be treasured when you spot it. And that's the job, certainly the entrepreneur people at Harvard Business School.